Grazie mille per essere qui. La conferenza si baserà su, diciamo, sarà divisa in un'ora più o meno di presentazione da parte del professore del tema, insomma, di oggi, e poi una, diciamo, sessione di domande e risposte di mezz'oretta. Se avete anche non solo domande ma anche considerazioni da fare sul tema, sono ben accette, finché si costruisca un dialogo, insomma, col relatore. Ecco, quindi chiederei anche in chat di lasciare le domande magari scritte poi o per l'ultima mezz'ora. Niente, buon evento a tutti. Sì, lascio la parola al professor Heinrich, che ringrazio nuovamente per essere qui.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me today. I know you've had an event already yesterday, so this talks volumes about your enthusiasm for studying. I follow activities of Geshin for many years with great interest. I think you're doing a wonderful work. I like the quality, I like the engagement of your work, and I'm very glad to be part of that. I'm also glad to see so many people. I was a bit worried since you can hear me talk every week at Ca Foscari. So thanks for coming today to this presentation here. So I talk today about language endangerment and well-being. This is a topic on which I've been working from 2022 to 2024, but my interest in that probably started some 10 years ago. And I will refer to it, how it started, how my interests developed. My talk today is structured in 5 points. We start first with language replacement endangerment in Japan, because this is fundamental to understand its interrelation then with well-being. I will then talk about a new field that has emerged recently, really only in the last 5 years, language and well-being. There is, well, only a handful of scholars really working on it, but still a handful is more than me. Then we shift to talk to the Ryukyus, where I did surveys on language endangerment and well-being. And we first will look at declining multilingualism there, because that is the independent variable. So that means that's the cause that which has an influence on well-being or ill-being. Then we look at the surveys I conducted, some of the results, before we take then an outlook and conclusion. I try to be brief, because being an academic, of course, I can talk for hours in continuation, but that gets boring, and maybe we can use some time that I talk about the things that really interest you, instead of just me talking about the things that I think are interesting. Please feel free to ask anything that comes to your mind, suggestions, but also criticism is more than welcome. Okay, so this has been a larger research project, and I did not do that all by myself, but in the field, I had the support of the Educational Committee of Yomitan Village, that's one of the research sites, and of the Library of Setouchi Town, that's another research site. Masahide Ishihara, professor at Ryukyu University, hosted us during the research. In the Ryukyus themselves, Yumiko Ohara, Tatsuro Maeda, and Seira Machida helped me with the research. And in Venice, Lorenzo Nespoli, who's now a postdoc, and Giulia Valsecchi, who was back then a master student, helped me with data input, data cleansing, and so on. And the research was financed by a spin grant by Ca Foscari University. So many people contributed to that. And I just present, the ideas are mine, and I just present the results, but it's not that I did all the work by myself. If we look at Japan's endangered languages, many of you will be familiar with that. We have Ainu in the north, as you know. We have Hachijo south east of Tokyo. Hachijo language, as you might know, is derived from Eastern Old Japanese, whereas the Old Japanese that you study in your language classes is Western Old Japanese. And then we have the 6 Ryukyuan languages, which are not derived from either East or Western Old Japanese, but have split from Japanese before Old Japanese developed. So it's a sister language. These are sister languages, but quite distant. And we tend to say that the distance between the Ryukyuan language and Japanese is about the same as between English and German. To give you an idea, and these languages in the Ryukyus themselves do not allow for mutual intelligibility. That is, if you speak a Ryukyuan language, you would not understand it if you only speak Japanese, right? Okay, so these are the endangered languages. The languages are endangered because they're placed in what I call a modernist setting. There's 2 large waves of language loss that we have experienced, and they always coincide with major economic changes. The first wave of language loss occurred when humanities stopped being hunter and gatherers and engaged in agriculture 10,000 years ago. That shift is still going on. We still have a few hunter and gatherer communities around the world, but not many. So hunter and gatherer languages were lost and replaced by agricultural languages. And the second wave is with modernity and the Industrial Revolution. So the languages that are surviving these days are not endangered, are usually national languages that have been created, modernized, and diffused after the Industrial Revolution. So the modernity has created a linguistic ecology which is hostile to the maintenance of smaller languages, and that has to do with a shift on how we look at space and language. In pre-modern period, we have the concept of frontiers and frontier land, which is expressed in Japanese by the concept of Ka-I, right? Ka is China or the center, and I is the barbarian. So it is view that looks at diversity like an onion. You have like the center and then layer after layer after layer of growing diversity, which is, if you think about it, an excellent conceptualization to think about diversity. So you are at a specific point, and whatever direction you go, you will, the further you go, the more diversity you will encounter. But this idea of space changes dramatically in modernity due to the rise of the nation states and the invention or the replacements of frontiers by borders, right? In Japanese, kyokai. So a border is something where you say, this is where, in our case, Japan starts and ends. And within these borders is the Japanese nation, and the Japanese nation speaks Japanese, right? So all of a sudden, diversity is still the same, right? But it's looked at differently. It's no longer taken for granted that you go and you meet increasingly different cultures, languages, habits, values, and so on. But you see everybody being unified, united by all these kinds of things, cultural, language, literature, and so on. And the diversity then is seen as a problem because its distance deviates from that. If you want to put it graphically, this is how one looks at diversity in a frame of frontiers. So it is horizontal. In modernity, it becomes hierarchical, right? So everything from the center is seen on the top, and everything that is, the more distant it is, the more problematic is seen. And problematic means it looks for a solution. And that solution at the height of modernity was assimilation. And assimilation in a way that left no traces of difference. This is why languages in modernist environments are endangered. This is nothing particular about Japan. Whatever map of whatever nation state I could project in here would be exactly the same story, because we live in a modern world. And you see that endangered languages are at the geographic periphery, right? So what happened is instead whatever was like far away and different now is in an order of sameness, and since it differs and it differs dramatically, is put very low. It's not valued. It's seen as a problem that asks for a solution. So this is the solution that happens in Japan. I'm just concentrating on Ryukyuan and Ainu, but there's also Ogasawa and Creole English spoken in Japan. There's also Hatijo language spoken in Japan, and there's also, of course, Japanese Sign Language, which at different points have been seen and identified as problems, which always look for the solution. The solution is always sameness, right, in modernist settings. So we have an idea, and that's new, that's modern. We have the attempt to create a unity, first as an idea, and then in reality of between state, right, Japanese nationals and national language, so Hokka, Kokumin, Kokugo, right, always nation in there. And then you have to deal, of course, with diversity. So the main groups that are usually discussed are the Ainu. So the Ainu are very, very different. They were mostly hunter-gathering. They were doing some agriculture, but very local, and they could not be seen as Japanese nationals. So a policy was launched to dissolve them. Intermarriage was promoted. They were framed as the dying nation, right? They're around, but sort of as if it was a historical mistake that they're still around, but they would vanish and by that resolve the problem, right? Horobiyuku Minzoku is what they were called in Japanese. It's a terrible name to be called that, and it's nothing but a miracle that the Ainu are still around, and that they have managed to maintain to some extent language, culture, beliefs, and values. So dissolving the Ainu was seen as an act of benevolence, buiku in Japanese. It was seen as, back in the day, we as a superior nation are accepting Ainu through intermarriage and thereby dissolving them. The Ainu, of course, seen as an inferior nation, also being called. The ideology which informed that is not some racist Japanese ideology, but it's social Darwinism promoted by Herbert Spencer, which was widely studied in Asia at the time, and in particular in Japan. So people thought that these kind of things would constitute progress back in the day, right? So this is why modern or modernist, the word sounds nice, but it has a lot of oppressive features, right? Creating sameness where there's diversity will do huge damage to everybody who's different. Treating people who differ the same way is the key mechanism to promote inequality. And therein lies the moment where we start, okay, maybe it has, maintaining this can produce well-being, losing it might correlate with ill-being. The story of the Ryukyus is different. The Ryukyuans were seen as distant cousins of the Japanese, so to speak, linguistically or culturally. Ryukyuan was seen as whatever you find in the Ryukyus as a variation of mainland Japan. And that view was not established by scholarships, but it was established by those who were in charge of assimilating the Ryukyu kingdom into the Meiji state. It was officials. There's a person called the Ryukyu Shobunkan, so the person in charge of assimilating the Ryukyu kingdom to the Meiji state. And he is the guy who first pitched the idea that everything we find in the Ryukyu is a variation of Japan. And since the difference is pronounced because everything we find in the Ryukyus as compared to mainland Japan, this difference was translated in terms of history. This is something that Japanese scholars learned from European scholarship. Humboldt was the first one to look at difference as time. So they said, okay, they're very different from us, which means it's very old. Okay, so difference now being seen as something old, as something remote, and so old and so remote that it would have no place in modernity. So be careful when always you will find this idea still today where people say, oh, the Ryukyus, oh yes, this is like the old, the pure Japan, and so on. This is nothing but a construct to take somebody's culture and to place it in the past because of its difference, right? Japanese folklore studies did nothing else but produce this narrative. Yanagita Kunio, the father of Japanese folklore studies, famously traveled from the mainland of Japan further down into the Ryukyus and wrote a book about it, Kaijo no Michi, the way of the ocean, right? Going up the ocean. And for him, it was taking a trip into the past. That's how he saw it. And that's what he describes in his book. He goes further south and south in the Ryukyus, he goes further down into Japanese history to find the pure, unmatched, ancient Japan, what he sees. But that's not what it was. That's a construct, right? That's a narrative which seeks to produce unity when, in fact, there is diversity. Okay, so these ideas are still around very often, and also, of course, among the Ryukyuans themselves, because it's the kind of stuff that is taught in school, that you find on television, and so on and so forth. And it's not that people sit at home and start critically thinking about these kind of things by themselves. They just repeat what the experts are telling them, right? So you still sometimes feel that. And I wrote a book about this scheme. It's called The Making of Monolingual Japan. And afterwards, I sort of got interested in what was actually the effect of language suppression and eradication campaigns. So I wrote about that at length and at details. And the first time I really started studying that, so I had an interest for a long time, was in 2016, when I was for half a year at Dokkyo University. And there I looked in particular about the effects of language eradication among the Ainu. And I'll be very brief in it. You'd find actually a lot of material on this. A famous source is Neil Gordon Munro, who was a British medical doctor who lived in Nibutani for many, many years. Nibutani is to these days a settlement in Shiraoi City in Hokkaido, where the majority of the population, 80% of them, are Ainu. So if you go there, it's an Ainu community. So he settled there and he treated them and he helped the Ainu. And he also wrote about them. And something that he wrote is quoted in Richard Siddle's excellent book on the Ainu, race resistance and the Ainu in Japan. And he writes, medical doctor Neil Gordon Munro described Ainu society in the 1930s, writing that cases of suicide among Ainu had been increasing and that the society was facing, and that's now a quote, a complex of alcoholism, abject poverty, surrounding detraction, psychic depression, and the demolition of the old social order. So what sometimes is the modernization of Japan or the modernization of Hokkaido has dark aspects of it, if you take it from the perspectives of the Ainu. And I got interested in now putting two stories together. One, the story that I had myself written a book about, namely language oppression, language shift, language loss, and then seeing what is actually happening to these communities. And there's a whole array of literature on that. And I then understood that there's not like two different stories, but this is the same story, right? And there is where the idea of language well-being, language and ill-being emerges. The 1930s, when Neil Gordon Munro wrote this, is exactly the time when the Ainu no longer passed on their language in the family, where they choose to speak Japanese. You also find, and there is a great number of surveys on Ainu language lifestyle, Ainu no seikatsu no jitai chosa, it's what it's usually called, so on actual state of their life. Some recent scholarship is this book, Gendai Ainu no seikatsu to Chiki Jumin, which compares the Ainu in Hokkaido together with the Shikijumin, that is the local population of the Ainu, and finds 150 years after their assimilation still traces of inequality wherever you look. Whatever factor you choose on to focus in, the Ainu will always be below the status than of the Hokkaido inhabitants. You see that the promise of integrating and assimilating and being equal, it never realized. And to these days, inequality exists, and we're now like 7th, 8th generation after the assimilation of the Ainu. So if creating sameness does not create equality and does not create well-being, maybe the contrary is the way to go. Maybe promote distinctiveness is a way that creates well-being. So I started back in 2016, 70s, playing these ideas. This is a bit of the literature that I find. Also, recently I was on the committee of a PhD thesis at Dokkyo University. Tatiana Zagelnik, who's Belarusian and herself a minority language speaker. She's Ainu, she's married with an Ainu man and has an Ainu daughter with whom they teach Ainu language. She has written an excellent PhD student on explore language trauma and empowerment in the Ainu context, picking up these ideas in great detail. Well, let's look then at the emergence of the language endangerment and well-being paradigm, and something that has inspired a few people is a study on indigenous language knowledge and its correlation with diabetes prevalence in Canada's First Nations. So, Canada's First Nations are known in general, Aboriginal populations are known to have shorter life expectancies, to be more prone to illnesses, to have lower academic degrees, and so on. Scholars of what is called public medicine got interested in what causes this actually. Why do so many Aboriginal people develop diabetes? And they look at various factors, what could contribute to that. And at one point, a group around a guy called Oster thought maybe language is a factor. And they looked at indigenous language factor, and you see in here, this is down there, we would always put the independent variable, the cause. So he looks at indigenous language knowledge as a cause for diabetes. And what is most interesting is it is related. We find a correlation between that, right? So you see these dots are individual people, and this then is the general trend that we find. And the higher your knowledge of indigenous languages, the less prone you are to have diabetes. The other way, the lower your language knowledge is, the more likely you are to develop diabetes. So this is, of course, not due to the language itself. It's not that speaking an indigenous Canadian language will sort of promote health, but speaking the language gives you access to knowledge, to community, that fosters a healthier lifestyle. Because assimilating minorities like the Aborigines, Ryukyuans, the Ainu, always means to assimilate them at the lowest stratum of society, where access to a lot of stuff that is good and healthy is very, very good, right? So this is very, very inspiring to see that. And we have now a few publications out there where linguists have turned to that. One of the reasons, it's from earlier, you probably want to Yeah, and where would that be? And maybe you should do that again, Stella. No. Here, yeah, because we're on a different, yeah. Okay. Yeah. We'll go back again here now. No longer able to return to my. Okay, here we are. So earlier this year, there was an edited volume by Lingua Pax, which is NGO linked to the United Nations, which promotes language diversity, where you have a collection of studies looking at language and well-being. And me and my associates, we also wrote a chapter in that. It's freely available. It's open access. You can look at that. Or former students of mine, Zi Wang, who is now an associate professor at Nanjing University, did a survey on the role of language in the well-being of migrants, looking at Chinese and Japanese migrants in Germany, and he finds that retaining their language correlates with well-being. So we have an emerging field of people who look into this. Okay, not many, it's not a mainstream topic, and if you Google it, you'd find very little links. So let's start learning a few things about language and well-being. This is also something that I had to learn along the way. So if you do research, you are permanently required to do something new. That means we are permanently required to learn something new. When I had first the idea that maybe language relates to ill-being and well-being, well, I had to learn something about well-being, obviously. The first thing that I learned then is that well-being is subjective and relative. That sounds quite easy, and I explain you what it means. Subjective data is data where you have to ask people how they feel about it, right? Objective data would be your height or your body weight or the color of your eyes or something like that, right? I can measure it, I can look at it, I can write it down. But if I ask you how happy you are, I cannot extract, I don't know, some blood and put it under a microscope and say, yes, you're happy, or I cannot put it on a scale, right? So this data is subjective. The analysis of it is still objective, right? Because sometimes when I teach, methodology and theory, people think that subjective data is somehow inferior. Some data can only be subjective, right? Like how, your attitudes will always be subjective. We cannot measure them. We cannot weight them. We cannot accelerate them or something like that, right? We can only ask you what is your kind of thing. So it's a subjective thing. Means it's you deciding, feeling how happy you are, how satisfied you are with your life. And it's relative. Relative means that there is no standard threshold against which it is set. It's not that you have like the global unit of happiness and this is where I relate to, right? It's subjective relative in the way that it's related to your world, to your presence at this time in this society, in this place. And you see both of that on the right-hand graph, which is something by economists. You see such graphs in every economic textbook, because well-being is studied in economics, in philosophy, and in sociology. So here we look at economy studies. You find here real GDP per capita. So, and this is of course translated into time, right? Because salaries rise and there's inflation and all of this kind. So this is already like in constant dollar, right? It's related as if there would be no inflation. Then we see that income is rising since the 1950s to the 1990s in this study. here. People have more and more higher salaries, and that means also they have more richer lifestyles, right? So back in the day, probably your parents or your grandparents can tell you about it. A television costed like 2 months' salary. Now you almost get them for free, right? They cost much less. You can consume more. So you see a rise in basically money that individuals make, and then we contrast this with life satisfaction, and we see it doesn't change. So contrary to widespread belief, money doesn't make you happy, right? The contrary is true. Lacking money, poverty makes you unhappy. But once you have the income where you pay your rent, you can participate doing things with your friends, and so on and so forth, increasing on that will make you happy for a month or two. But you say, oh my God, can't believe, I've got a salary raise, I've got a job. And then, because it's relative, you will become used again. You said, well, it's only normal. I work so hard. Of course, I have this salary, right? Everybody has an iPhone in my company. Of course, I have an iPhone as well. It does not improve your happiness, right? At a certain point. So that is what is meant by it's subjective and relative, right? You see, because it says the same, it's relative. People get used to the lifestyle, right? If you think once you graduate and have a job and will have an income, you will be you will be happier. Forget about the idea. It will only be happy. You will only be happy for a month or so. You also see that when you buy something expensive, people know that it doesn't make you happy. There's always like something in there, like a message like, you bought an excellent product. Congratulations. Because they already know that it will wear off the effect of being happy, of having purchased, what do I know, a nice phone. So this is one thing. The second thing that we need to know when we talk about okay, well-being can be positive or negative, right? We saw that something can make you feel well, something can make you feel bad, right? And this is something that we call ill-being, right? Well-being can be situational, and this is captured, for instance, in the notion of happiness. Happiness studies look at that. So during a day, you go through various moods, right? You, I don't know, meet a friend on the street and have a coffee, and that will make you happy, but then it rains and you get all wet and you get angry and the happiness is gone. But this is not something that we'll look in because that's not related to the language. Or it can be long-term, for instance, if we study life satisfaction of people. We know that individual well-being is related to genetic disposition. That just means some people are happier than others, and there's not much you can do about it. But it's also due to the social environment, so it's both, right? Like even if you put a very happy person in a terrible environment, that person will become less happy, and vice versa. Somebody who's not that happy, even in a nice environment, will become happier. But there's differences between people in the assessments of well-being. We also know that people are resilient. So whenever you have something that makes you deeply unhappy, you're being heartbroken, relatives have died, unemployment, stuff happens, right, in lives. Usually one bounces back. And the same is true also for events that cause happiness. For instance, we know that the birth of children causes happiness for a while, and then parents get used to having children and the effect wears off. Then there is a new wave of happiness actually when the children move out. So parents, it makes parents happy for a while, and then they get used to live without them. So very often people fluctuate around a set level of well-being. Research has identified various factors which durably contribute to well-being, happiness across cultures. We've seen that money is not such a thing, right? Absence of income makes you unhappy, but it's not that money as such promotes well-being, but health does. Existence of friends does. Family does, but also lack of corruption, for instance. To live in a corrupt environment will make you unhappy. Okay, and now the question is language a factor that contributes to subjective well-being? Right, that is a research question. And always in research, I always say it's speculative, empirical. We always start speculating. We always think like, I think the speakers look happier than the non-speakers. And then you think like, there's no way to know that unless you studied empirically. Right? And if we don't know anything about anything, then we usually choose quantitative methods because we don't even know whether there is a relation or not. So I'm not promoting quantitative methods and say this is the best methods to study anything. But if you start from scratch, if you don't know anything, that's usually how you do it to see, is there a relation, yes or no? Once you know there's a relation, you can shift to other forms of study. So very often the research question and the amount of work we know will dictate how you study it. And also in this case. So if you're interested in well-being, Daniel Nettles' book, Happiness, it's both brief, informative, well-written, and inexpensive, is a very good place to. So this brings us now to the Ryukyus. I've been doing field work in the Ryukyus for 25 years, and that helps a lot because I've basically been everywhere and talked to many people, so that considerably helps. I choose two sites to do this research. The main site is Yomitan village. Here it's right in the middle of Okinawa Island. Those who know Okinawa will know that this is like the touristy section. There's just hotels, very few people live there. Onasan is very beautiful. Up here, this is more or less jungle, right? It's called Yambaru. And from here to here live, well, 1 million people. It's one of the most densely populated places in the world, actually. And when you think like Okinawa is pretty and beautiful, it is pretty and beautiful, but not necessarily in that area, right? This is very cramped. Densely populated, and of course there's all these military bases and so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, just opposite of it, this is Kadena, is the biggest military air base in all Asia, right? It's just sitting next to it. So I choose them because they're well known, as a matter of fact, to maintain language quite well. So I choose that. And then as a second case, I choose Amami. Amami is, right, the Amamian language is located in Kagoshima prefecture, but not in Okinawa, right? The prefectural line Okinawa is there. And very often Amami language is understudied because it's in a different prefecture. So I choose to do something like that, not to always exclude them. But the main site was Yomitan, where I collected 1,374 data sets. People who answered to the questionnaire. And I will be only talking about this case today for reasons of time, obviously. So now we look at what causes or what might cause, right? Because we're still in the realm of speculation before we have the results. What might cause different levels of well-being, and this is the declining social multilingualism in the Ryukyus. So the hypothesis is the more Ryukyuan language you speak, happy you are. The less you speak, the less happy you are, right? This is the kind of thing that I want to study. This is the situation in the sociolinguistic situation. In the Ryukyus, we usually distinguish between 3 to 4 types, or sometimes 5 types of speakers. We have the full speakers. Full speakers are people who speak the language in all its registers, and this also includes honorifics. So there's honorific language in Ryukyuan languages, but this register was the first register that was lost in language shift, because whenever you had to speak formally, you had to speak Japanese, right? So languages don't die word by word or morpheme by morpheme or phoneme by phoneme, but they're getting lost in what we call domains, right? A domain is who talks to whom about what and where. So that is a domain, right? So there's family is a domain, religion is a domain, neighborhood is a domain, which triggers specific language choices if there's multilingualism, right? Multilingual communities don't set up rules which language they speak, but they choose specific language for specific domain. But this is the language of the home, but this is the language of the school. This is the language of the neighborhood, but in the post office I speak another language. This is how it works, right? And the first domains that are lost are always like the higher domains, we call them, namely those, related to work, administration, school. And all of this is, of course, the domains where one would speak or be required to speak honorific language. So, so full speakers. Then we have rusty speakers. Those are those who do not speak honorific language, and also they have been exposed less to it, so they have more difficulties to speak to it. We have passive bilinguals, a huge group of passive bilinguals, those who grow up listening to Ryukyuan languages but never encouraged to speak it. If you do research on Ryukyuan languages, you can work with them very, very well, because they will help you to analyze and translate your data. They know how the language works, but they're not able to produce it. Very much like, think of everybody here who is Italian, but has never studied Spanish, right? You're basically passive bilingual in Spanish, right? If I write you down something in Spanish, you will help me to analyze it, to understand what it is. But if I say, can you make a presentation in Spanish? You would say, well, I actually don't speak it. Right? So there's a whole generation like that with the Ryukyuan languages. Then there are monolinguals or token speakers. People just use specific words like greetings, saying thank you, and so on and so forth. And now we have a new category, namely new speakers, of which there are about 200, 250 in the Ryukyus. These are people who learned Ryukyuan language and very often became quite fluent in their adulthood. They didn't learn it as children. So this is our independent variable. So we try to measure these 1,300 people to understand in which of these categories do they fall. And questions include, for instance, I can use Shimakutuba, that's how they call it, right, the local language, in daily conversation. Or I can understand Shimakutuba in daily conversation. They'll go like, oh, these are the, those who say, I understand, but I don't use, these are the passive bilinguals. Or when I was a child, I have often been exposed to Shimakutuba. This is a sign of people who might be passive bilinguals, but we also ask, for instance, what language you usually use with your grandparents, parents, partner, and so on and so forth, to understand how well they speak or do not speak the local language. These are questions that I developed many years ago, more than 20 years ago, when I measured language vitality. So the data in the Linguistic Atlas of UNESCO that you saw, for instance, that is data of research that I did in 2004, 2005, using this kind of questions back then. So I knew these questions would work. So I used them. This is then the result that we look, for instance, in Yomitown village. So which language do you speak to whom, right? You would have here standard Japanese to the grandparents, parents, siblings, partner, children. So you see standard Japanese is increasingly often used, right? The younger people are. This is then Okinawan Japanese. Okinawan Japanese is the local variety of Japanese, which has influence from Ryukyuan languages. It's also called Uchina Yamatoguchi, right? Uchina being Okinawa, Yamatoguchi being Japanese, right? The language of Yamato. So we see that is also declining. And this is then Okinawan itself, that you see it's retreating, right? This is what is happening, right? Language shift. The younger the people are, the less they speak. And then other languages. Some people speak other Ryukyuan languages. Some people have, American relatives. So we see here a spread of standard Japanese. Not really surprising. We already knew that. If we then look at a question like, I can speak Shimakutuba in everyday conversation, we used a Likert scale from 1 to 7. So strongly disagree would be 1, disagree 2, and so on and so forth, all the way to strongly agree 7. Now we can classify our individuals who participate in this service into different speaker types, right? Those who say, I agree, I strongly agree, this looks like a speaker of Okinawan, right? These we could say probably passive bilinguals, these probably monolinguals, right? So, and these then we try to relate to the dependent variable, the stuff that we're really after. We're not really interested in that. We're just interested in this as a cause to well-being, right? We will then cross these variables with our results on well-being. Another question, of course, right, to understand who is a full speaker is to ask. I can use honorific speech in Shimakutuba, and you see there are some people who are able to do that. Then the dependent variable, I'll introduce to various questions. We asked all kinds of questions. One very famous question is so-called Cantrell's letter. Every year you read the results of the World Happiness Report. It will arrive at you, I don't know, in the newspaper or, you know, on Instagram or TikTok, whatever you look at. That's when you always learn that the Finnish are the happiest people in the world, right? They asked these questions. So this is a research instrument that I did not have to develop. I just took it, and it was already translated in Japanese on top of that, because it's being asked year after year in Japan as well. But the question goes as follows in English. Imagine a letter with 10 steps that depict life satisfaction. The 10 at the top represents the best possible life for you, with lower numbers indicating lesser degrees of fulfillment. On which step of the letter do you feel you stand now? Right? 10 is the best possible life, 0 the worst. I usually say I'm 8, quite a happy person in general, but you know, people place themselves at different points of this letter. This is the result that we have in Yomitan. So the average in Yomitan is 6.2. Right? You in your mind probably will have thought, you know, how happy are you from 0 to 10? So keep that in mind. Now we look at the World Happiness Report in 2024, where we see, right, Finnish, as could be expected, terribly happy. It's amazing, right? If you thought about yourself, how happy you are, and understand that you have to ask representatively the whole population, that the average is 7.7 is mind-boggling. The Finnish really are very, very happy. And then you see all these Scandinavians up there. Italy, if you look for it, it's 41, 6.2, right? If you're 7, you're happier than the average. If you're 5, you're less happy than them. The Japanese are at 6.1 here, 6.06. The Japanese somehow surprise us because we think they should be happier. Everything that we know that contributes to happiness, long life, health, good education, family, safety, you know, functioning government, we're like, why are they not happier? There's a few countries which puzzle us. France also puzzles us. The French also should be happier than they really are. But this is now Japan, and there comes the moment of truth. Are the speakers happier than this? If not, I burned all that money of Ca Foscari to study that in vain. And they are, right? 6.7. So full speakers would be somehow like the Germans, right? Notably happier. Because I presented that data 2 weeks ago in Vienna, and people said, oh, you know, only 0.6 difference. And I said, that's a lot. That is a lot. What do you want them to be, like 12, right? And if you look now at the passive speakers and the monolinguals, they're exactly like the Japanese, 6.1. Also somehow unsurprising, right? They're Japanese after all, right? They're everything that makes you Ryukyuan, like the language is not just like something that you know how to make a sentence, it places you in the world differently. It gives you access to knowledge, to practice, to values. It makes you participate in specific events and so on and so forth. So yeah, the relief was big when I saw that. Right, so let's look at the results again a bit more closer. I leave away the math and the statistical details. Usually when it's green, we can exclude that it's by chance. If it's not green, there might be a possibility that the relation is by chance. And this requires more analytical steps. So, but here, so this is green, so we can safely exclude that this is by chance. The thing that puzzles me, first of all, I was relieved that the Ryukyuan speakers are happier, but the thing that puzzles me is that the passive bilinguals and the monolinguals show no difference, right? Because my hypothesis was the more you speak, the happier you are. And obviously the passive bilinguals have something that the monolinguals don't have. They understand it. And I understood, or I'm thinking right now, that my view of language might be wrong, because this presupposes a view that we all have in contemporary social linguistics, namely that language is a resource to do things, right? And if we have the idea that language is a resource, which is of course a metaphor, right? Then the passive bilingual has something that the monolingual doesn't have, right? He has a resource, maybe he can understand. But this hints that language should not be seen as a resource, but should be seen as a phenomenon that resonates. Right now I'm interested in resonance, namely to only take in but not be able to go out will not create a resonance within you. It will not make you participate in that. So I think this also hints, other than that maintaining your language will make you happy with your life, I think this also hints that language should not be simply seen as a resource, but something that can provide for resonance inside you. And just taking in without the ability of engaging, getting out, will not create this. But this is something that I'm currently interested in. And this is how research works. You always find out something, and then you're presented with a new question. And then you go like, I did not expect this, and you go after that, right? This is why research is never done and never finished. Right, so this is just as interesting to me as this number is. We can also look at different things, because I asked them many questions. For instance, satisfaction with life scale. This is another instrument that is widely used in studies on well-being, and it was also translated already in Japanese, so I just had to copy-paste it on my questionnaires. For instance, if we ask, in most ways, life is close to my ideal, you would always see speakers, passive bilinguals, monolinguals, right? Whenever it's green, we are already safe. We don't have to do further math to see whether there's a moderating variable in that or not. The conditions of my life are excellent. You see the same. I'm satisfied with my life. The same. So far, I have gotten the important things I want in my life. Well, if I could live my life over, I would change almost nothing. Same patterns here. And where we see that we have very good relations, because that study is actually just a pilot study, since we didn't know anything about it. I just thought I start somewhere, and I was throwing everything I could find at the informants. Now we see that some questions work better than others, right? We can like sort of reduce the questionnaire and focus on specific things and think, why is it that some questions work better than others? Right, but you always find this. I find it wherever in the data, the speakers are always more fulfilled with their life than the passive bilinguals and the monolinguals. Right, another thing that I was interesting, this is now what I call a moderating variable, because I'm interested, maybe there's no direct relation between language endangerment, your ability to speak it, and well-being, but maybe speaking the language reinforces identity, identity makes you happy, right? This is what we call moderating variables. If we look at it, so these are again, we call this an instrument, right? When you ask this question, an instrument I developed myself. So I asked, for instance, people born and raised in Okinawa are proud of it. And I thought this might be indicative of, their identification with the place, against measuring on a Likert scale from 1 to 7, right? To say like, no, I don't agree, to I totally agree. Or I am who I am today because my ancestors were born and raised in Okinawa. Okinawa, as you know, places a high emphasis on ancestor worship, and ancestors and family and elder people are very much respected, much more than in Japan itself, where you already find. We live our lives based on culture, custom, teachings passed down from our ancestors, or I think Okinawa can be a model for other prefectures when it comes to culture and human relationships. You always find the same things, right? This is again this is called the cross-tabulation, where you see this is the response of the people, right? Who said, like, can you speak Shimakutuba? 1, right, means not at all, 2, like, I speak it very well, I totally agree, right? And that you see that these numbers here, right, these are the full speakers who answered 6 and 7, are always higher than the others. So it fosters this, unsurprising, right? If you speak the local language, you will identify more and more deeper with the place you live in, and the less you speak, the thinner the relationship gets. I once was told many years ago that somebody said, well, Patrick, I like your engagement for Ryukyuan languages. But he said, but language is only spoken in the community. It's only, and community in Okinawan is Shima. It's only spoken in the Shima. And I answered, yeah, but that's where you live. That's where you live. It does matter, even if it's just a local language, right? You think, oh, there's English and standard Japanese and all of that. But all the while, you live in a concrete community, and speaking that language of that community, of course, is important, right? And there we see it, right? I told that guy, well, that's where people live. Not speaking the language of the Shima, can be seen as a problem. And here we see data actually confirming that. Also, another thing, and then I'll open the floor to questions very soon, is I was interested in social capital. That is like, how much do they embrace the values of the community? How tightly are they integrated in them? This is also questions that I develop and I ask, for instance, how often do you take part in community activities against? It's always the Likert scale from 1 to 7, right? 1, very rarely, 7. Often there is a strong habit of helping each other. This is a traditional Ryukyuan habit called Yimaru, where people have always helped each other. And it probably comes, from living in a harsh environment. When there was a typhoon and your house had been damaged, everybody would come and help you fix your house, because the next typhoon, maybe it's your house, or the flooding and so on. So there's this tradition. Or asking, most of my friends live in Yomitan. I know my neighbors well. I trust people from Yomitan. Residents share common culture value again, right? From 1 to 7, do you agree? Do you disagree? Or being a resident influences my identity. And then you would always see again that full speakers exhibit very often higher rates than the passive bilinguals and the monolinguals, right? So you lose a connection to your community. Looking henceforth, other than learning things about well-being, I also had to learn how to do statistics, and not terribly fond of it. It's a lot of work. Very, very time consuming. If you have 1,370 questionnaires with know how many, 40 questions, and these questions themselves made up of various sub-questions, just putting in that thing into a database took more than a year, right? And then you start calculating it, not knowing whether actually it will yield the results that you want. I'm not encouraging everyone to go down that street. And that's why where people helped me in all of that, because I don't have 1 year to spare just to punch in numbers into a computer. You can also study that, of course, through interviews, now that we know that there is a link. And I looked at all the interviews where I was actually looking at something else, but I found traces of people talking actually about wanting to promote well-being. So here I was interviewing new speakers and language activists in the Ryukyus, and these are some of the kinds of answers that they gave me. I was not specifically questioning them about well-being. Somebody says, by learning Ryukyuan, I want to become someone who can help younger people. By speaking Ryukyuan, I hope I can contribute to a better future, right? Using the language to improve something, right? To improve community life. So it's, they always talk about themselves, what they then want to achieve, but you also find out that they always speak like, and if I achieve this, I can do this to the community. This was something that I found, a pattern that I found in these interviews. By speaking Ryukyuan, I hope I can contribute to bring back Okinawa for Okinawan people. By learning Ryukyuan, I want to become more active in a way that I can contribute more to Ryukyuan society. By speaking Ryukyuan, I hope I can contribute to raising people's awareness to stand with people who are marginalized. This is the number one thing I want to achieve by speaking Ryukyuan languages. Right? This is published book here. Something else that I'm looking for is now, I talked mostly about the relation from language to well-being or from here to here. I still have to calculate the relation from language to here and then to well-being, right? And I hope that through that I can improve the statistical reliability of the pattern that we see. This is the last slide with data. I know it's lots of numbers in this presentation. We also see that acknowledging that Japan is diverse has an impact on well-being. There are some people who believe that Japan is diverse, that it has diverse languages, diverse cultures. And there's people who think that everything in Japan is somehow a variation of Japan, right? That it's unified in language and culture. And when we we had a question where we looked at the acknowledgement of diversity. Do you believe that Japanese is a homogeneous country united in language, culture, and beliefs? And then we did the reverse culture. Those who strongly believed, we gave 1, and those other 7 to keep the same relation in the table, right? So these are those who would think like it's unified. Right? There's only one language, one culture. And you see life is close to my ideal. They take out less out of life than this. If you believe that Japan is homogeneous and that the language in your village is Japanese, then you just end up being on the very periphery at the end of Japan in a place that is boring and not linked to anything. If you understand there is a local culture, a local local values, a history of its own, you look at your community very, very different. You place yourself at the center of something. Otherwise, you place yourself at the periphery. You're at the back of behind if you believe that everything is Japanese. Because everything Japanese, like the center is Tokyo, Kyoto, Kansai, you know, or if you want to improve that, at least Kyushu, right? But if you believe, oh, this is Okinawan language and culture, it's like, I'm in the middle of it, right? So you see that with all these kind of questions that we had before, right? That the number here is increasing. Sometimes we see, well, not with these questions, but with language question, that those who speak language best sometimes have decline in well-being. And this is something that I also have to study. Could be due that the best speakers are usually also very old. And if you're very old, you know, that comes with a share of problem. Maybe, you know, your spouse has died, maybe you're ill, maybe you have economic problems, maybe you're isolated, and so on and so forth, right? So not everything can be attributed to language. These are some questions, some pictures from the fieldwork itself. So this is in Amami, where I sat an entire month on this table in Umi no Eki. So this is the ferry terminal where people would pass and things there. And as I talked with everyone at Setuichi at one point, this is the Machi, Professor Machi from the public library. Turned out he had the same teacher as I had, namely a very famous Austrian ethnographer called Josef Kreiner. When he found out that I had studied with him, he was immediately collaborating. This is the head teacher high school in Yomitan, who then helped me to distribute questionnaires also in Ominkan in community centers. Right, thank you for your attention. And guess it's time for questions. Sorry for speaking for such a long time. Also, before I forget, anybody who wants more Ryukyuan, the day after tomorrow is another talk by a German professor, Professor Vogt, in San Sebastiano, Aula 24, right? Might want to consider it. Feel free to ask anything, right? I know I glossed about a lot of things that you might be interested or want to know more about. Look yet, because it's a mountain of data, we did not look yet at gender differences, but we know that women shifted quicker to standard Japanese than men did, because it's seen, right, because it's, right, variation is no longer seen as horizontal, but as hierarchical. And it's then endangered languages, also like, for instance, dialects in Italy, right, is the same thing, would be seen as rough and not cultured. And in particular, girls, when they grow up, are discouraged to speak that. But we also know that in language activism, the women are very, very active. So sometimes that we see, and we don't only see that in the Ryukyus, but we see that in endangered languages around the world, is very often the guys would talk policy and we need to do this and write a petition. And then you go into a language revitalization circle activity and you only see women. So this is something that very often happens. So they are strongly engaged in that. We can look into this gender relation because we have data on that as well. I have not had time yet to look into that. Usually, generally, sociolinguistically, we are always interested in gender differences because we know that women are more sensitive to changes, and they're more sensitive to changes usually because they have a weaker position in society. They observe things quicker, so they're a barometer of change. So they were the first to drop the language because it was seen as not good, and they're also then the first to see like, no, it does something very well. So very often, if we make the gender comparison, we somehow see the dynamics in it. The bigger the gender relationship is, difference is, the gender difference is, the more it could be thinking, we can think that something is changing right now. And if it's the same, we think, okay, that looks stable, right? Also, traditionally, if we're studying endangered languages or dialects, very often we ask men only because they're just more conservative, right? They're slower to adapt to change. So you get like an extra old version if you ask an old man in comparison to asking an old woman. Well, it would always be good to have data about it. And I have a survey, but it's very little on new speakers, where I asked 50 people. I don't see a particular pattern in there, but currently I'm interviewing new speakers and I'm looking into that. And what new speakers generally tell me, so new speakers are people who they usually grow up as passive bilinguals and at one point decide I should learn it. They talk about two things. Sometimes they're enthusiastic about finally picking it up and being happy about it and coming back and revisiting childhood memories. Or I have one who said, when my mother died and his mother was very old, the last conversation I had with her was in Okinawan, and it was the first time I talked in Okinawan with her, and I'm very happy that I did that. And she was relieved as well that she could speak with me in that language. So sometimes it's very, very touching what you hear, but also they talk about frustration, that they say, because when you learn it, you realize you should have been speaking that language your entire life. And it makes you angry that you couldn't do it. And people say sometimes they get angry, they say sometimes they cry when learning the language. And this is also why I don't call this language learning, I call this language reclamation. Like, we all learn languages, and it's sometimes we're discouraged, and sometimes we're like, oh my God, it's so difficult, I'm not making any progress. But we're not breaking down and crying over learning Japanese or other languages, right? But for them, it's deeply emotional and frustrated, and sometimes they're very, very happy about it. So it seems to be like a double-edged sword, and they look to form communities where they can share this experience together. They don't like to be in public, and but they create what we call safe spaces where they are between themselves. And I myself have participated twice in such a setting. And yeah, it's very, very delicate because it's also like embarrassing because they identify as Okinawans and they say, this is my language. And then it's your turn to speak, that you speak very little, right? So, you don't want people to say, like, oh, I would think you speak better. Is that all you have, right? So it's important to have these safe settings where they can experience with these kind of things. The same is happening, by the way, also with Ainu. They also have creating these safe spaces where they can experiment in being a speaker of Ainu. Because if you're socialized in Japan, you're socialized as being a speaker of Japanese and nothing else but Japanese, because anything else undermines your Japaneseness, right? There's no hyphenated Japanese. There's a thing as Okinawan Japanese doesn't exist, or Ainu Japanese. You're Japanese, and if you're Japanese, you have to be Japanese all the way. And now you have to do something. You have to unlearn something, right? And that is not easy. And sometimes it's frustrating. Sometimes I see it as liberating. Very often they get criticized by the full speakers. They say, what is that good for? Or they say, oh, but you don't speak very well. Or this is not how we say it. So it's very, very harsh. Whereas when we learn Japanese, we all know we are all being complimented all the time, how wonderful we are doing, right? This is not what they're experiencing. It's quite difficult. Also developing that kind of fluency, because there are not many resources. And if you look for somebody who then ultimately speaks with you Okinawa, not many will speak with you. Selective people will speak with you. Very often they try to switch as quickly as they can back to Japanese because they're not comfortable in speaking with you Okinawan language, or some of them will bury you under a tsunami of Okinawan, which is too difficult for you because they've never learned to adapt. Right? It's always only been a language of first language speakers. The idea of second language learners in Okinawa is just 10 years old. It doesn't exist, so they don't really know how to deal with that with somebody who somehow speaks intermediate Okinawan. So yeah, it has both aspects of it. They all believe it will make them happier. Yeah. What you refer to is what we call in linguistics linguistic relativity. We know that languages, right? I mean, it's not that reality exists out there and then we name it, but we create reality through language, and languages do that slightly different. Also, modernized languages are very, very similar because modernized languages you are intertranslatable. You can always translate, Italian into Japanese, and so modernized languages through modernization have become more similar, but still they depict things slightly different, right? And there's research on linguistic relativity in the Ryukyus, not much as two people who look in that, and we know that they perceive things, or they capture things through language differently. And yeah, we can believe that this is one of the factors, right? I mean, why are they happier when they retain the language? Of course, it's, they're closer to community, they identify more, but also ultimately they are in the Ryukyus, right? The stuff around them is Ryukyuan, and the Ryukyuan language was developed in that environment. So there's a seamless fit between the environment there, like, the physical environment, but also the cultural environment, the social environment. And there is no real detailed research in that. We just understand it works slightly different from Japanese. When we, for instance, look at colors, we know that colors are perceived different in Ryukyuan language than in Japanese, and also different between Ryukyuan languages. Also, some activities like breaking, ripping are seen differently between them. One guy, I don't get the story together anymore, but he told me that Japanese kawaiso, right, which is like pitying someone, is Chimuguri-san in Okinawan, and he says like Chimuguri-san is like it's empathy. Kawaiso is more like, oh, poor guy, where the other is like it has an element of empathy in it. And he's a new speaker, so he's learning that. So that's something he discovered, that he, exactly what you're saying, that he said like, oh, and this is so Okinawan, right? That we care about others so much that our, in his view, like our idea of pity is so much warmer, is so much more heartfelt than the other one, that he was very happy about that particular example. And I think, one can study this, and one best studies that by interviewing people and by asking, for concrete things, or, I believe there is a relationship between them. One weakness of my study, right, and I pointed that out already, was the fact that I looked at language as a resource instead of something that resonates, right? And this seems not to work because we have the same ratio of well-being between the monolinguals and the passive bilinguals. But that also means, once you understand it, that I questions about language proficiency was wrong, because I asked, like, are you able to, right? Can you do this? Much better is, do you use it, right? It's the use, it's not knowing the thing itself probably has very little effect. It's using the language that will affect that. So, whenever you do a survey, right, you do obviously the best you can do, but at the end, you will always be smarter when you think, like, if I were to do it again, I would ask that question differently. And, it goes in the direction that you're pointing out, right? It's the activity, it's the way you place yourself in this world, is how you look at things. It's that makes you happier. It's not just saying, I spoke Ryukyuan. If Ryukyuan does the same thing as Japanese, we don't need Ryukyuan languages, right? There's no need to be exactly the same person with the same sensation, with the same life, with the same attitudes, just in a different language, right? Then one language is superfluous. It's very important in our understanding of linguistic diversity. In order to maintain diversity, it has to have a function, and these functions have to be complementary. That means Ryukyuan language or Ainu language or sign language or whatever language you're interested in has to do something particularly good that standard Japanese doesn't do. Unfortunately, standard Japanese does a lot of things not very well. Right? It does a lot of things exceedingly well. It's great for writing. It's great for communications. Great for like scientific thought. All of that. With Ryukyuan, you are in deep, deep trouble. But maybe about neighborhood, about friendship, about humor, about your value, about the things that you care about your community. Ryukyuan language is unbeatable in the Ryukyus for this. And around this, does language revitalization have to be built, right? Yeah, because Kochiso summarized what we call fatigue communication. It's not really in telling you it was very good. It's to agree social relationships, right? It's to create a bond and to say you gave an effort and I appreciate it. It's like saying hello. Hello too, it's like, or how you do. Usually we're not really interested how you do. It's just like, to communicate, I care about you. And so I asked, right? There's two more, Stella. There's two more questions. There's one here and one at the corner. Yeah. So ultimately, the question is about what we call utility in language, right? What is a language good for? The answer, of course, is always that, and something that we all know, the more languages you speak, the higher utility, the more you can employ that, because language gives you access to various things, allows you to do things in a specific way, allows you to place you in the world in a different way. And very often when we think about languages in contact, we always think about language in competition, right? If you put Ryukyuan language in competition with Japanese loses. Put Japanese in competition with English, Japanese loses. So it's always like, that's not the way how to conceive them in language revitalization, but you will have to find a certain niche where that language does something, and then invite people, who are interested to participate or not. You also do not want to oblige people to learn that, right? You do not want to have the same movement just in reverse. In the past, they were forced to learn Japanese. They never asked for it. Now you don't want to ram Ryukyuan languages down their throats. And, people are learning it. It's not that it comes top down. Top down, nothing happens in Japan. It's grassroots motivated. So they're doing it for a reason, right? And if sometimes one wonders, my own professor, when I started doing that 25 years ago, he always thought like all of this kind of stuff is futile because it's like, who needs Ryukyuan languages? And I said, yeah, but people are doing it. Just go and ask. Just because you don't know why they're doing it doesn't mean it's meaningless. Go there and ask, and people do find meaning in it, so that's the way to go about it. And one thing that we saw through language shift, right? Because language shift, so that's a process of endangerment, is that there's always usually the Ainu only spoke Ainu, right? And the Ryukyuans only spoke Ryukyuan. Then came Japanese, right? So there was a phase of bilingualism, and then there was only Japanese. Right? But it's very important to understand that for 50 years, there were like 2 generations who were perfectly bilingual. So when everyone thinks bilingual is just for us, right? Us who go to university and sit there for years and study with a textbook, everybody can be bilingual, right? And you see that, it's not even like some claim or some political propaganda or something like that. You go there, they were for 50 years, people were perfectly bilingual in Ainu and Japanese. Right? And this is what you would restore. And then for those interested, of course. And then, you would have the benefit of whatever Ryukyuan gives you. And you would have the many benefits that Japanese provides for you. To conclude this thought, currently in Japan, everybody is learning Japanese for many, many years. Right? They start in the 4th year in elementary school. They have native speakers visiting, and so on and so forth. And if you ask Japanese, do you speak English? 10% of the population say, yes, I speak. And that's probably that's probably the relation, what we really find. So 10% say, yes, I speak English. They speak English because they need English. 90% don't need English, and so they don't speak it. Right? And now we have the idea that English is beneficial for everyone, but this sort of data hints at the fact that it's beneficial for 10%. And these people, of course, have to learn, and it's important that they learn English, right? If you're like international, I don't know, like salaryman, businessman, if you're a scholar, if you're engaged in some global NGO, you need English. But 90% learned English in vain. Maybe they should have learned Ryukyuan, maybe they should have learned Ainu, maybe they should have learned Japanese Sign Language, maybe they should have learned Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese, something else. It's almost a pity to having had to force them year after year after year to sit through these languages, just because English is the most prestigious language and the most utile language that has ever existed in the history of mankind, does not mean that for these segments of society, this holds true. Right? So we have to look at the things from different personal, individual necessities. And the Ryukyuan languages, they will never again be spoken like they were, at the onset of the Meiji period. But many more people would probably like to speak it, would like to learn it, if you'd only give them the possibility. And that's the thing, give them the possibility, right? Give them the freedom to learn and maintain the choice to learn Ryukyuan if you want to place yourself in this world in a specific way. This is also something that we learned from this language and well-being connection, right? That so whatever promotes well-being for me might not promote well-being for you. But if we leave various options open, right? If we create like a liberal language policy and educational policy, that will benefit the largest segment of the population. And that is a good policy. That is a good education system. For some, maybe, yes. For some, maybe. I myself, the first person who taught me Okinawan, Inamine Sensei, I've interviewed her in 2005, I think, and she said she had not taught her children Okinawan. And she said that she was teaching now her grandchildren Okinawan. And she said to me, and I'm doing that because I don't want, and then she used the English word merit. Says, I'm tired of this society which only thinks about merit, 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 merit. This is how she put it. She repeated it, merit, 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 merit. And she said, I will provide them, and she used the Japanese English term, skinship. I will provide them skinship, Okinawan skinship. Right? Skinship is like intimacy that is non-sexual, right? Really, really close. And she would say, I will do that through Okinawan. And then you see that for her, it's sort of a protest against this married society. Traditional Okinawan, it took me a while to understand that, but the traditional Okinawan value sees aspiration as something negative. So we all are in an environment where we always think, speak better Japanese, speak 4 languages instead of 3, learning how to code, learning how to do statistics, right? That all of this improves us. And they would always be very critical. And it took me a long time to understand what it's about. I thought, like, what is it like? Not being ambitious, not trying your best, being lazy? But that's not what it's about. The gist of it is, you are fine the way you are. You don't have to do this so that we like you. But this is the Okinawan skinship. You do not have to excel. You do not have to have the best grade in class. You do not have to learn yet another language. You do not have to learn. We like you the way you are. And if you want to do that, do it. But you don't have to do it so that we like you. There's something very, very beautiful in that, right? And there's something very cold and, yeah, I don't know, like almost like an economy of skills and affection, right? The more skills you bring to the table, the more we like you. Who wants to be part of that, right? So it took me a long while to understand this Okinawan sentiment. I find it very, very beautiful. And I understand that when I looked back at the interview with Inamine Sensei, because I always thought, like, what does she mean by skin? Right? And she was so angry about his merit that she repeated it several times. There's one on the very right. Yes. Yeah, sure. No, please feel free to comment. Yeah. One misses one's language, right? One misses a language one misses a language one thought one should have learned. And one think about it, everything that would have been possible and how you could have talked, right, to your grandmothers and to relatives in China. Oh, it's deeply touching. Everybody who's somehow had not access to language, or people who lose a language, right, through language attrition very often, they feel the same way. It's deeply personal. And people feel like that in Okinawa about that as well. Yeah, and it all points out that, it started out like, is language a factor that durably contributes to well-being? And the underlying notion between that is that the languages are not all the same. Some languages mean more to us, right? It's not like X is Y. It's not a mathematical equation. So you don't happen to speak, I don't know, like some immigrant languages, but you speak Italian and you speak Japanese. And it's that particular language that does something more profound than any other language does to you. The languages are not all the same, right? And this is also something that we learn from this research. It matters which language you speak, will affect your well-being.
There are just 2 people. So
I can always continue to talk if you want.
I don't know if they will kick out because
Yeah. I can pick up on what you say and what you have said. Maybe all that interest in language and social linguistics personally comes from my own life experience. And I think whatever you are studying, whatever you're interested in, it always relates to you, even if it's, Japanese theater or something like that, and you thought like, there's no link, but maybe inside of you, there's always a link that connects to that. And with me personally, I grew up in a multilingual family. My mother was French, my father is German, and we spoke French at home. And I remember vividly, it's one of my first memories of my grandfather, because we spoke French at home. I never thought of myself as anything else but a French guy. I actually learned German only in kindergarten and school. And I have memories of not being good in German. Now German is the only language I really speak well. But I remember that somebody asked my grandfather when I was visiting in France, "Il parle français, does he speak French?" And he said, "Un petit peu, a bit." I was like 7, I thought like, what do you mean, un petit peu? Like, I'm French. So I vividly remember that. And my French has terribly deteriorated. It was only a language of the family. I've never learned it formally. And since I speak French so rarely, it's fossilizing and there's language attrition, right? I have difficulties to speak it, but I try to go very often to France and to cling on to it as much as I can. As a matter of fact, as soon as the semester ends, I'm in Toulouse for an entire month as a visiting professor there. But recently, my mother passed away, and I started listening to the music that she liked, the music of my childhood, which is French chanson from the 70s. Listening to that kind of music has an effect on me which I could not have foreseen. It's not that it brings me to tears or something like that, but there is a warmth, happiness, sense of protection that no other music is able to provide for me. So there is a real link of having been exposed to that. And I was just reminded that, language matters. It matters which language you speak, right? It provides a link with you that other languages do not have. Another story where I learned these kind of things, I learned a lot about language shift with that. I have a daughter who was born in 2011, and we were living in Japan back then. And then the question would be, which language would we speak to her? So my wife would say, well, I speak Italian. She's Italian. Of course, I speak Italian. And then we were in Japan, and I think like Italian and German, and we are in Japan. So I thought, okay, I will speak English to her. Right? You speak Italian, I speak English to her. And then, she actually went to Japanese kindergarten. She started to learn Japanese. Unfortunately, she forgot because we moved to Italy, but said, okay, I will speak English. And that was the deal. And then my daughter was born, and there were complications, which meant that my wife had to get operated, and she was getting operated, and she was not there. So it was me with a newborn daughter, not even 10 minutes, 2 minutes old. She was covered in blood, and she was crying. And I put my hands on her to calm her down. I spoke German. You cannot speak a foreign language in that situation, because there is a language in you that resonates so much deeper. You cannot go into the rule like, English is the global language, this is that, I said to her, it's all good. I'm your dad. I introduced myself to her, touching her, and she listened to my voice and she stopped crying. So there is a link in language which is really, really strong. And when we always think, language is something that you put on your CV and you put a number on, I'm B2 in this or C1 in that, that doesn't mean a thing. Language is really, really deep. There's a real connection of how we feel and how we do. And even if we speak multiple languages like we all do, there is one language within us which is really, really deep, right? That connects much stronger than other languages. And all of this has to do with language and well-being. Right? So this is not just some marginal kind of topic that we look at and, look at a few numbers and measure the relationship. It's very, very powerful. And yeah, I'll be very glad if you think about that and appreciate the language, in particular the language of your family, right? Whatever language it is, whatever language variety it is, whatever dialect it is, whatever is specific about communication in your family, you know, that is what really and truly defines you.